How's it going, guys? I'm Kyle with Newegg TV, and today I'd like to welcome all of you to our first ever episode of Yolk'd. So, without further ado, let's get started. This week in the tech world, Tim Cook has some explaining to do. Since the October release of Apple's iPhone 4S, swarms of users are already claiming that the new device barely exceeds the battery life of a potato. Apple's support site is now flooded with thousands of user complaints that the phone's battery life is shockingly lower than advertised. That's a lot of angry birds. So far, there have been alleged reports of user phones being shorted as many as 100 hours of standby time, which means 4S users will now have to think twice before not using their phones. In response, Apple has admitted that the culprit behind the 4S's battery life stems from a flaw in the iOS 5 software. But not to fear, they're releasing a software update that should completely rectify the issue.
Yes!
In a few weeks.
Oh.
That's right. Weeks. And a few weeks? I mean, what kind of answer is that? I guess it just depends on Apple's definition of a few. But until that day comes, the world turns in desperation to the great Siri for answers.
Siri, why do you have such low battery life?
Sorry, I am having trouble connecting.
Aw, the battery just died.
That sums it up for the tech world today, and now we'll shift gears to our new segment, Probing Paul, where Paul answers your tech questions.
So that's the name we're going with for my segment. Okay, I have a couple questions from our viewers to answer here. The first is from Will J. Meakin, and Will asks, "Hi, I just watched a tutorial on how to build a computer part 2. You say I should set up my motherboard outside of the case first to test for defective parts. You turn it on by shorting 2 pins with a screwdriver, however you don't say how to turn it back off. It feels wrong to simply turn off the power. Thanks." That is a very good question, Will, and I happen to have an outside-of-the-box build going on right here. You can use the pins right here for your front panel, and to turn it off you can simply short those again using the screwdriver. That will essentially do the same thing as pushing a power button, and this motherboard happens to have surface-mounted power and reset buttons. Since at this point we're just doing a test build, we don't actually have an operating system that's loaded onto an SSD or a hard drive. When you're just doing the test build outside the box and you're not booted into the operating system, there's really not much harm that you can do in turning the computer off at this point, either by shorting those pins or by actually just turning the power supply off. The only real danger is if you're, for instance, reloading your motherboard BIOS or something like that, that you would actually potentially do some harm to your computer by shutting it down without going through the proper shutdown procedures. Our next question comes from a YouTube user whose name I will not repeat. We'll just call him John. And John asks, "Hey Paul, I was just watching the video of your crew doing the build-off, and I heard you tell Joanne to put her power supply with the fan down in the half case. I have my power supply fan pointing up. Does this affect performance or just a dust or cooling issue?" And thank you for the question, John. I happen to have the build here that Joanne and Danny did, and here's the power supply that they installed with the fan on the underside. Now, there's a few things to take into consideration here, but generally speaking, if I have a case that has vents right here at the bottom that's raised up off of the ground a little bit so you have enough airflow under there, I'll point the fan down, and that's pretty much so it's pulling in fresh, cooler air from outside the case to cool the components in the power supply and then eject it out the back. It's not really affecting any of the additional airflow in your case. However, you might be in a situation where you actually want to pull more air out, depending again on the case that you're using, depending on where you have intake fans and outtake fans, because you do want to have roughly the same just to keep a steady airflow going through the case. It's going to vary, so you might want to actually try either way. It's not too tough to flip a power supply. The one thing that I will say about having the fan facing up is that you do open up the potential for, let's say you're working somewhere else in the case, you drop a screw and it can go right down in through that fan. So that is something to consider if you have it pointing up. As far as performance goes, it's not really going to affect much because power supplies, if they work, they work. The only real situation where you have less performance is if the power supply does not have enough juice to, say, handle your CPU overclocked. But really, it's up to you, but bear in mind your airflow, bear in mind the possibility of dropping something down into the power supply if you have the fan facing up. But you'll notice a lot of power supplies actually will have logos on either side now, so whichever way you put it, you're still going to have that logo there so you can show everyone that you have a nice power supply. And that's all for my Q&A segment. I think the jury is still out on what we're actually going to call this, but feel free to keep those questions coming in, and we'll send it back over to Kyle.
Thank you, Paul, and that's going to wrap it up for this first ever episode of Yolk'd. And on a final note, we want to hear from you guys. So let us know what you guys think about the whole 4S situation down in the comment section below, and about the show in general. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm Kyle with Newegg TV, and you've just been Yolk'd.